The United States Navy finds itself in an extraordinarily precarious position tonight, and what we're witnessing is nothing short of a fundamental realignment in how America projects power across the Middle East. Now, I want to be very clear about what's actually happening here, because the mainstream narrative simply isn't capturing the full dimension of this crisis. We have multiple carrier strike groups now positioned in and around the Persian Gulf region, ostensibly as a deterrent against Iranian missile capabilities that have, quite frankly, evolved far beyond what most Western analysts predicted even 5 years ago. But here's what makes this situation so remarkably dangerous. Iran's missile arsenal isn't just larger, it's fundamentally more sophisticated, more accurate, and more capable of overwhelming traditional naval defense systems than at any point in history. We're talking about hypersonic capabilities, swarm tactics, and precision-guided munitions that can theoretically saturate the Aegis defense systems that the Navy has relied upon for decades. Meanwhile, Trump is walking an absolute tightrope here, facing pressure not just from Tehran, but from European allies demanding diplomatic restraint, from Israel pushing for confrontation, and from a deeply divided domestic audience that has no appetite whatsoever for another Middle Eastern conflict. Now, to really understand the gravity of what we're dealing with here, we need to step back and look at how we arrived at this particular juncture, because none of this is happening in a vacuum. The relationship between the United States and Iran has been deteriorating in fits and starts ever since the collapse of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was, of course, the nuclear deal that the Obama administration negotiated and that Trump subsequently withdrew from during his first term in office. That withdrawal, which happened back in 2018, set off a chain of events that has led us directly to where we are today. And I think it's absolutely crucial to understand that the Iranians have not been sitting idle during this period. They've been developing, they've been testing, they've been refining their military capabilities in ways that have fundamentally altered the strategic calculus in the region. What we're seeing now is the manifestation of years of Iranian military investment, particularly in their ballistic and cruise missile programs. The Iranians have taken a very deliberate approach here, and it's one that deserves serious analytical attention because it's actually quite sophisticated when you break it down. They've recognized quite correctly that they cannot compete with the United States in terms of conventional military forces, in terms of air power, in terms of naval capabilities in the traditional sense. So instead, they've invested heavily in what military strategists call asymmetric capabilities. These are weapon systems and tactical approaches designed specifically to exploit the vulnerabilities of a technologically superior opponent. And make no mistake, the United States Navy, for all its impressive capabilities, does have vulnerabilities, particularly when operating in the confined waters of the Persian Gulf. The geography here is absolutely critical to understanding the military dynamics at play. The Persian Gulf is not like the open ocean, where American carrier strike groups typically operate with relative impunity. It's a narrow body of water, roughly 180 miles at its widest point, and in some areas much narrower than that. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply passes, is at its narrowest point only about 21 miles wide. This is an extraordinarily confined operational environment for naval vessels that are designed to project power across vast oceanic distances, and the Iranians have spent decades developing weapon systems specifically designed to exploit this geographic reality. They've positioned anti-ship missile batteries along their coastline. They've developed fast attack craft that can swarm larger vessels. They've invested in submarine capabilities. And most significantly, they've developed a missile arsenal that is purpose-built for this exact scenario. Now, when we talk about Iran's missile capabilities, we need to be specific about what we're actually discussing, because there's often a lot of confusion in the media coverage about this. Iran has developed several classes of missiles that pose different kinds of threats. There are the short-range ballistic missiles, the medium-range systems, and increasingly what appear to be hypersonic or near-hypersonic capabilities that have been displayed in recent tests. The Iranians have also demonstrated the ability to conduct precision strikes, which is a relatively new development that has really alarmed Pentagon planners. We saw evidence of this back in 2020 when Iran struck the Ain al-Assad airbase in Iraq in retaliation for the killing of Qasem Soleimani. Those strikes demonstrated a level of accuracy that frankly surprised many Western military analysts. They hit specific buildings, specific targets within that base, showing that Iran has moved well beyond the crude, inaccurate missiles of previous decades. But it's not just about the missiles themselves, it's about the doctrine of how they would be used in a conflict scenario. The Iranians have made it very clear through their military exercises and their public statements that in the event of a conflict with the United States, they would not be trying to win in a conventional sense. Instead, their strategy appears to be focused on making any American military operation so costly, so complicated, and so risky that it becomes politically unsustainable. They would aim to inflict enough damage on American forces to create a domestic political crisis in the United States, to shatter the international coalition that might support American action, and to disrupt global energy markets to such a degree that the economic consequences would be catastrophic. This is not a strategy designed to defeat the American military in a traditional sense, but rather to make the cost of victory so high that victory itself becomes meaningless. And this brings us to the current deployment of American naval forces, which is really quite extraordinary when you look at the details. According to various reports, the United States currently has at least one, possibly two carrier strike groups in the region, along with additional guided missile destroyers, cruisers, and support vessels. This represents a massive concentration of American naval power, and it's meant to serve as a deterrent. The idea, presumably, is that by demonstrating overwhelming force, the United States can convince Iran not to take provocative actions, not to threaten shipping in the Gulf, not to attack American interests or those of American allies in the region. But here's the problem with this logic, and it's a problem that I think hasn't been adequately addressed in most of the commentary we're seeing. Deterrence only works if both sides are operating from the same strategic assumptions, and if both sides believe that the other side's threats are credible. The Iranians have repeatedly demonstrated that they're willing to take actions that the United States considers provocative. They've seized tankers, they've conducted military exercises in disputed waters, they've supported proxy forces throughout the region that have attacked American personnel and facilities. They've done all of this despite the presence of significant American military power in the region. So we have to ask ourselves whether simply adding more ships, more firepower to the equation is actually going to change Iranian calculations, or whether it might actually have the opposite effect. There's a real risk here that the Iranians might perceive this massive American naval deployment not as a deterrent, but as a provocation, as evidence that the United States is preparing for military action, which could lead them to adopt a more aggressive posture themselves as a form of deterrence or as a preemptive measure. Now, let's talk about Trump's position in all of this, because it's absolutely fascinating from a political and strategic standpoint. Trump came into office with a very clear message about wanting to end what he called endless wars, wanting to bring American troops home, wanting to focus on domestic issues rather than foreign military adventures. And yet here he is, facing a situation where there are very real pressures pushing him toward a potential military confrontation with Iran. Some of these pressures are coming from traditional American allies in the region, particularly Israel and Saudi Arabia, both of which view Iran as an existential threat, and both of which have been pushing for a more confrontational American policy toward Tehran for years. Then you have pressures from within his own administration, from certain factions within the Republican Party, from parts of the national security establishment that believe that Iran needs to be dealt with more forcefully. But At the same time, Trump is acutely aware of the political risks of getting drawn into another Middle Eastern conflict. The American public, by and large, is exhausted with wars in that region. The experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan have created a deep skepticism about American military interventions, about nation building, about the whole enterprise of trying to reshape the Middle East through military force. Trump knows this. He's very attuned to public opinion, and he knows that his political base in particular has no appetite for another war. So he's caught in this extraordinarily difficult position where he needs to appear strong, he needs to support American allies, he needs to respond to what are genuinely concerning Iranian actions, but he also needs to avoid getting sucked into a conflict that could become politically catastrophic for him. The international dimension of this is equally complex and equally important to understand. The Europeans, particularly the French and the Germans, have been trying to salvage some form of diplomatic engagement with Iran ever since the United States withdrew from the nuclear deal. They've maintained that dialogue is essential, that diplomacy is the only viable path forward, and they've been deeply concerned about the possibility of a military confrontation that could destabilize the entire region and send oil prices skyrocketing, which would have devastating effects on the European economy. So they've been urging restraint, they've been pushing for negotiations, they've been trying to serve as intermediaries, but their influence is limited, in part because the United States has made it very clear that it's not particularly interested in European mediation on this issue, and in part because the Iranians themselves are deeply distrustful of European intentions after what they see as Europe's failure to protect them from American sanctions. Then you have the role of Russia and China, both of which have strategic interests in maintaining good relations with Iran. For Russia, Iran is an important partner in Syria, an important counterweight to American influence in the Middle East, and an important market for Russian weapons and technology. For China, Iran is a crucial source of energy and a key component of the Belt and Road Initiative. Both Russia and China have made it clear that they oppose American military action against Iran, and both would likely provide diplomatic cover for Iran in the United Nations Security Council in the event of a conflict. This creates a situation where any American military action against Iran wouldn't just be a bilateral conflict, it would immediately become enmeshed in the broader geopolitical competition between the United States and its rivals. What makes this situation even more complicated is the question of what would actually trigger a military confrontation. There are multiple potential flashpoints here, and each one carries its own risks and dynamics. There's the question of freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz and the broader Gulf region. If Iran were to attempt to close the strait or to significantly impede commercial shipping, that would almost certainly provoke an American military response. There's the question of attacks on American forces or facilities in the region, either by Iran directly or by Iranian-backed proxy groups. We've seen numerous such attacks over the past few years, and while most have not led to major escalation, there's always the risk that one particular attack could cross a threshold that demands a forceful response. There's the nuclear question, the possibility that Iran might make a sudden dash toward nuclear weapons capability, which would create enormous pressure on the United States and Israel to take military action. Each of these potential triggers exists in a state of ambiguity. It's not clear exactly what would constitute an unacceptable Iranian action. It's not clear what kind of American response would be proportionate. And it's not clear how either side would climb down from escalation once it began. This ambiguity is dangerous because it creates the possibility of miscalculation, of situations where one side takes an action thinking it's within acceptable bounds, only to find that the other side views it as a major escalation requiring a forceful response. We've seen this pattern play out in other conflicts throughout history, and it's one of the primary ways that wars that nobody actually wants end up happening anyway. The economic dimensions of this crisis are also crucial and often underappreciated in the analysis we see in the mainstream media. Any significant disruption to oil flows through the Persian Gulf would send global energy prices soaring. We're talking about a potential shock that could make the oil crises of the 1970s look mild by comparison. The global economy is still recovering from the various disruptions of recent years. Inflation remains a concern in many countries, and a sudden spike in energy prices could tip many economies into recession. This creates a weird dynamic where countries that might otherwise stay neutral in a US-Iran conflict have a strong vested interest in preventing such a conflict from occurring or in ensuring it remains limited if it does occur. But it also means that Iran has significant leverage through its ability to threaten global energy supplies, leverage that it can use to try to deter American action or to rally international opposition to American policies. Looking at the military balance more closely, we need to understand that while the United States obviously has overwhelming conventional military superiority over Iran, that doesn't necessarily translate into an easy victory or even into the ability to achieve specific political objectives through military force. The United States could certainly destroy Iranian military facilities, could decimate the Iranian Navy, could strike missile sites and command and control centers, but doing so would require an extensive air campaign, would likely result in significant Iranian retaliation against American forces and American allies, and wouldn't necessarily solve the underlying strategic problem. Iran would still be there. It would still have residual military capabilities. It would still have proxy forces throughout the region. And it would likely be even more determined to develop nuclear weapons as the ultimate guarantee of its security. This gets to a fundamental problem that has plagued American Middle East policy for decades now, which is the gap between military capabilities and political objectives. The United States has the military power to destroy virtually any target, to defeat virtually any conventional military force in the region, but it has repeatedly struggled to translate that military power into stable, favorable political outcomes. We saw this in Iraq, where the United States easily defeated Saddam Hussein's military, but then struggled for years with insurgency and instability. We've seen it in Afghanistan, where American military superiority was never in doubt, but where achieving lasting political settlement proved impossible. The risk with Iran is that we could see this pattern repeat itself on an even larger and more consequential scale. There's also the question of what happens the day after any potential military conflict. Let's say the United States does launch strikes against Iranian missile facilities or nuclear sites. What then? Does Iran simply accept this and back down? That seems highly unlikely, given everything we know about Iranian political culture and the Iranian leadership's view of its place in the region. More likely, Iran would retaliate, either directly or through proxies, leading to further American strikes, leading to further Iranian retaliation, in a cycle of escalation that could very easily spiral out of control. And at each stage of this escalation, the risks grow, the stakes increase, and the possibility of a negotiated settlement becomes more remote. We also need to consider the domestic political situation in Iran itself, which is complex and which plays into how the Iranian leadership calculates its options. The Iranian regime faces its own internal pressures, its own domestic critics, its own economic challenges, exacerbated by years of American sanctions. In some ways, an external threat from the United States could actually help the regime consolidate domestic support by rallying the population around the flag, by portraying the regime as the defender of Iranian sovereignty against foreign aggression. This is a dynamic we've seen play out in various countries throughout history, where external pressure that's meant to weaken a regime actually ends up strengthening it by giving it a nationalist cause to rally around. So where does all of this leave us? We have an American naval deployment that's meant to deter Iranian aggression, but that could potentially provoke it. We have an Iranian missile program that's sophisticated enough to pose a genuine threat to American forces, but not sophisticated enough to actually defeat the United States in a prolonged conflict. We have a president who wants to avoid war, but who faces significant pressures pushing him toward confrontation. We have international actors with competing interests, some wanting to restrain the United States, others wanting to encourage American action against Iran. And we have multiple potential flashpoints, any one of which could trigger a conflict that neither side actually wants, but that both sides might feel compelled to fight once it begins. The next few weeks and months are going to be absolutely critical in determining how this situation evolves. We need to watch carefully for any signs of de-escalation, any diplomatic openings, any attempts by either side to create space for dialogue. But we also need to be realistic about the challenges here. The gap between American and Iranian positions is enormous, the level of distrust is profound, and the regional dynamics create pressures toward confrontation rather than toward compromise. This is a situation that requires extraordinarily careful management, clear communication, and a willingness on both sides to step back from the brink, even when domestic political pressures push in the opposite direction. Whether we'll see that kind of statesmanship remains to be seen, but the stakes could hardly be higher, not just for the United States and Iran, but for the entire global system that depends on stability in this vital region.